the questions that I've asked each of them to address as briefly as possible are, firstly, what drives business engagement in developing countries today, and is business transforming development for better, for worse?
What drives business engagement in development? I think it'd be nice to think altruism plays a part in it. And I suspect that for some that is absolutely the case. But broadly speaking, most businesses are involved in this type of activity because there's a business reason for it. So it is some form of enlightened self-interest. And I guess, depending on your degree of cynicism, the motivation for that self-interest will vary from brand protection, fending off the critics that exist for industry, quite rightly in many cases, or through to something that actually has a longer-term perspective on development and what development can support from a business perspective. So one approach is really around supply chain investment and recognizing that for a company like Cadbury, there is a huge dependence on agricultural products and smallholder farmers that produce them. And for the past 100 years, businesses looked at it in one way, and I think now some businesses are starting to look at it in another way, that you can no longer sit at the end of a supply chain that might be thousands of miles long, where ingredients pass through dozens of hands to reach a factory in Birmingham, in our case, and actually expect that supply chain will continue if you don't take a greater involvement. So I think in that case, enlightened self-interest is about saying we need to work more closely with those farmers. We need to understand what motivates those farmers and what we can do to be part of that supply chain more effectively, as opposed to just buying something and excusing lack of activity because it's somebody else's responsibility. And I think particularly when you talk about agriculture, there's a growing recognition that agriculture in the developing world is starting to fail. That there's increasing pressures through things like climate change, quite obviously in many cases, but also from lack of investment from national governments, lack of investment from donors. The aid budget for agriculture has fallen from something like 20% 10 years ago to about 3% these days. And realistically, therefore, from an industry perspective, if you're dependent upon agricultural crops, who else is going to start to step in and help those crops to continue? So enlightened self-interest there is fairly obvious, I think. But again, I mentioned about degrees of cynicism. At times, industry is involved because it is about issues management, as the corporate affairs teams would say. It's about defending criticism of companies, however well-placed or misplaced that might be. It's sometimes about a CSR agenda. Now, one might argue that the CSR agenda is not much more than nice window dressing to support a brand, or it's about something that will mature and mature into something that is perhaps truly sustainable in a development context and that actually leads to long-term change on the ground. And I think the strength of the engagement is determined by the strength of the business case. And I tend to try and evaluate business engagement with development programs against three sectors. One is there a supply chain or an operational benefit or need that you have to satisfy? One is there a brand reputation or a brand management issue you have to consider? And thirdly, is there a commercial case for doing it? Is it going to help you sell products? And if you can balance all of those three, then you have something that sits and is truly sustainable business and can lead to that long-term commitment. So to the second question, is this actually transforming development for better, for worse? The best I can say is perhaps, because depending on which type of engagement business is involved in, it can be creating scale, it can be very substantive, it can translate these very esoteric policies or into something that happens on the ground, or it can provide scale up to multiple small projects that otherwise won't achieve scale. Industry sits between those two and has a great opportunity, I think, to deliver scale. But on the other hand, sometimes industry activity is very polarized. It brings polarized views that aren't necessarily applicable or appropriate to the development context. It brings a very siloed approach, because if your concern is for the issues management, then people tend to tackle that one thing and forget that things like child labour exist not because of a single issue, but because of a wide range of issues that exist. And trying to tackle one thing on its own can lead to unintended consequences. I think industry also tends to take a very technocratic approach. Find a simple technical solution. It's what industry does well in other areas. But growing cocoa, growing other crops is not like running a factory. It's very different. There are a lot more socioeconomic factors that you try and understand. So it is changing, I think, however. I think more and more of the time, industry is looking at scale change, substantive engagement, and engagement that can lead to long-term development opportunity. But the indicators for that, for me, are whether there is true partnership, whether it's a discussion between purchasers and producers, origin country governments, civil society perhaps, to try and find a rounded and holistic solution. So I think my answer to whether it's making a difference to development still would have to say is perhaps for now, but I see some positive signs, but also some negative ones. Thank you.